And we call this identity fusion. And the reason we call it that is because your personal identity and your group identity become effectively fused together.
One of our goals was to inform policymaking, but also tech firms and the intelligence community on how to better prevent and also intervene when someone is radicalizing towards violence.
I think that anthropology can contribute significantly to not only a deeper understanding of why we buy, but how to manage and even manipulate that in order to get us to buy more. And this is a potential problem in a world where we are, as consumers, behaving in ways that are unsustainable.
Hello and welcome to the Winners Word podcast, where we unearth what it takes to succeed at the Market Research Awards from the winners themselves. I'm your host, Lewis Reeves, CEO and founder at Walr. And today, our guests are the President's Medal winners, Professor Harvey Whitehouse and Dr. Julia Ebner from Oxford University. A huge welcome to the both of you. To start us off, I would love just to get a real quick background on the both of you. So perhaps you could just give us a quick introduction on yourselves.
I'm Harvey Whitehouse. I'm a professor of social anthropology at the University of Oxford. I run something called the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion, where we are studying group bonding, what it is that bonds groups together. And we're looking at how social glue evolved over thousands of years and what we can do with it in a positive way.
Hi, I'm Julia Ebner, and I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford at the Centre for the Study of Social Cohesion and at the Kaliber Centre for Evolution and Human Science. And my research focuses on terrorism, especially the psychological drivers of violent extremism and radicalization trends.
Fantastic, thank you. This podcast, we really love to focus on the impact that research data and insight can have. And I'm so excited that both of you joined from perhaps less traditional backgrounds than some of our other guests. And so I'm extremely excited to get into the topic that was the award-winning one for the both of you. Harvey, to start with yourself, can you give us just a little bit of a background, an overview of the work that you guys have been up to?
Well, one strand of our research is very much focused on how we come to align ourselves with groups. For many years, social psychologists have been studying something that they call identification, which involves a sort of very strong sense of commitment to a group, and to, in many cases, we're members of many groups based on identification. But it's a kind of a depersonalizing form of group alignment, in the sense that when you make the group identity salient to a person, their personal identity becomes less accessible. So I don't know about you, Lewis. Do you support a football team?
West Ham United for my sins.
Okay. Well, if I got you talking on about the Hammers for any length of time, you'd pretty soon stop being very aware of your personal identity as Lewis and start talking about your identity as a supporter of West Ham. And that's a very important form of group alignment for people. But over the last 15 years ago, psychologists have discovered a form of group alignment which is much stronger still, which really taps into your personal identity as Lewis. And we call this identity fusion. And the reason we call it that is because your personal identity and your group identity become effectively fused together. And that means if we start talking about the Hammers, it's going to activate your sense of personal agency as Lewis as well. And if we are rude enough to attack West Ham in some shape or form, it will be something you'll take personally. And that means you'll potentially do all kinds of things to protect the reputation of your beloved club. Now, an extreme form of that is what we think is happening with violent extremism. More positively, it's also what happens with forms of heroism in our sort of conventional armies, something that we admire. But it has this very negative, dark side to it as well.
Incredible. And from that, what sort of has influenced you to take this down the route of really exploring the darker side of this, clearly for positive good?
Well, it all started for me in Papua New Guinea, of all places. I was living for 2 years continuously deep in the rainforest with a tribe whose language had never been described. They had no electricity, no running water, but they had a very rich culture. And my job as an anthropologist was to learn about that. Part of that involved becoming initiated into the group. And those initiations were designed to put you through some pretty arduous ordeals as a way of bonding you to the group. And in the past, you know, those forms of group bonding were really important to the survival of the group, because it's what bonded warriors together on the battlefield. Coming out of that, I wanted to understand what it is about sharing intensely painful negative experiences that causes bonding. And then when the fusion measure that I've just described was invented, it became possible to develop studies that look at how sharing very painful experiences shape your personal identity. And when that's shared with a group, it creates this fusion mechanism. Now, for a long time, we were trying to understand how much people would do for the group by using hypothetical measures of the effects of fusion on willingness to fight and die for the group. What we really needed, though, was to find a population of people who are actually laying down their lives for each other. And in 2011, as the Arab Spring kicked off, it became possible to get into countries like, I went to Libya, to Misrata, to work with insurgents who were actually laying down their lives for each other in huge numbers. And there we were able to start to pick apart the pathways to fusion that involve very intense experiences of frontline combat, which, just like these initiation rituals in Papua New Guinea, were bonding people very tightly together. And that, combined with a very plausible and salient outgroup threat, was driving the willingness to lay down their lives on the battlefield. And from that developed a sort of fusion plus threat model. And at that stage, I published an article in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in which they have this setup where you get commentaries from a wide range of colleagues, up to 50, I think in this case, wrote in with commentaries. And from that, we've discovered lots of potential mediators between fusion and this willingness to lay down your lives. And that's the point at which Julia came into our professional world with her wonderful skill set, and we decided to design some studies together.
Fantastic. And that leads on really nicely, Julia. So you come to this incredible thesis with a researcher hat on. Start telling us how we brought it to life from a research perspective, what methods were considered and what the structure was.
Yeah, it was really fascinating to me when I first came across Harvey's research, because it provided the missing pieces of a puzzle that I'd been trying to solve. I was more coming actually from a practical side, because I was advising governments and the intelligence community before coming to Oxford. And so Harvey's theory on fusion and threat, that combination really seemed quite strong. And so what we tried to do was we wanted to find patterns, psychological patterns that show up in language and in the communication materials of terrorists and violent extremists. And we used a mix of methods. We used natural language processing, NLP, but also complemented that with qualitative text analysis. So it was a back and forth between quantitative and qualitative linguistic analysis. And it was quite striking. The results were really interesting, because we did find that the statistically most important and most significant factors were indeed identity fusion, threat, but also a few other variables that were kind of coming up in combination with identity fusion. So for example, the dehumanization of an outgroup or the demonization of an outgroup, which is something that terrorism researchers have flagged before, but the identity fusion part of it was really missing in the whole of the security studies and terrorism studies world. So it's something quite novel. And based on these different statistically significant factors, we developed a framework that we then tested on online groups. So we first developed this framework based on the manifestos of actual terrorists who've been convicted for terrorist attacks. And then we applied and tested that in online groups. So in the conversations and chat kind of logs of violent extremists versus average forums. So we also had a control group there.
And for the benefit of the audience, how are you getting hold of that information, of the data? You were able to scrape that offline?
Yeah, that was quite a big challenge for the project, because of course we're talking about lots of different types of platforms. We did scrape the content, but it was various different chat forums, but also open forums, Telegram channels, a few channels on Discord, on that gaming platform. So it did require us to scrape the data and then plug it in with the NLP model that we developed.
Incredible. And clearly thus, these conversations are happening in front of our very eyes to make this research possible.
Yeah, that's one of our goals was to inform policymaking, but also tech firms and the intelligence community on how to better prevent and also intervene when someone is radicalizing towards violence. Because one of the biggest challenges for them right now is that there's a huge ocean of death threats and threats to violence in the online sphere. And of course, it's very hard to distinguish between what's a credible threat and what is just empty words. So drawing that line can be really difficult. And they, in some ways, face a needle in a haystack problem that we've been trying to help them with. Of course, our model cannot replace manual investigations, and we wouldn't advocate for that, but it can definitely help with resource allocation.
Yeah, indeed. And Harvey, maybe to come back to yourself around the desired impact that you think this can have and how far it can go. I think, Julia, you mentioned some great points there around scale. Clearly, there's the extreme ends of this, but there are also lighter fractions of this. It'd be interesting to get your perspective of how deep this work could impact that.
Well, now that we have some good insights into how people become fused with a group and how that impacts things like violent extremism, it becomes possible to develop interventions that are not necessarily the most obvious or intuitive ones that you would think of. If you think of most approaches towards to the problem of radicalization, they tend to target people's ideologies. And the work that Julia and I do suggests this is probably the worst possible place to start, in the sense that what you're doing is creating an even stronger sense of threat to the group, because those ideologies are very powerful group identity markers. If you really want to undermine and sort of modify the pathway to fusion itself, the best thing to focus on actually is people's personal life histories, stuff that people generally are quite happy to talk about, but which is part of the process by which their personal identities and group identities become fused together. Actually, there are initiatives kind of like this going on, for instance, in Indonesia, where work is going on within prisons among convicted terrorists to develop methods of exploring people's life histories by getting them to describe their life as a river, and as they pinpoint key moments, defining moments in their life along that river, it becomes possible to interrogate the question of how shared those experiences really are, because it's that sharedness that really lies at the heart of the fusion mechanism. You could imagine approaches like this being rolled out on a much bigger scale, so that, for example, in communities where there's a great risk of extremism bubbling up, you could develop forms of propaganda and other forms that, with the involvement of the media and perhaps with advertisers and all kinds of internet platforms, etc., to try to provide sort of messaging that is going to reduce the sort of inflammation or the risk of fusion in those communities.
Indeed, and hence this can form a predictive nature in the sense of understanding someone's early journey, and thus the likelihood of them to become extreme or perhaps even into criminal behavior in later life.
I think that's absolutely right. It could certainly help with early detection and with early intervention. So those are crucial aspects that I think our theories could speak to. And I've been talking with various senior members of the law enforcement in the UK about these issues, and in New Zealand most recently. And we're going to, I hope, start to build some real practical interventions based on this research.
Incredible. And to broaden that out ever so slightly, how do you think that sort of social anthropology can shape wider market research? Do you think it has a role to play?
I do think anthropology has a big role to play, potentially. I mean, as I understand it, market research is fundamentally about what we buy and why we buy. And I guess the what we buy question is relatively easy to answer. Not easy, but it's relatively easy compared with the why we buy. I think where anthropology has a big contribution to make is in relation to that very complex question of why we buy. In fact, I'm giving a webinar to the Market Research Society on 27th of June, in which I'm going to try to lay out what I think anthropology can bring to the table on that question. I actually think it can bring a lot to the table, and this raises a bit of an ethical dilemma from my perspective, because I think that anthropology can contribute significantly to not only a deeper understanding of why we buy, but how to manage and even manipulate that in order to get us to buy more. And this is a potential problem in a world where we are, as consumers, behaving in ways that are unsustainable. And market research has a potential role to play in exacerbating that problem or addressing it. And actually, I'm very interested in how it could help to address it. In fact, I'm going to suggest when I get the chance to give this webinar that maybe what we need is a sort of international association for ethical market research, which brings academics and people working in the industry in market research together to think about ways in which we can make the insights of anthropology and many other disciplines useful for the development of more pro-social, more positive forms of marketing that lead to more sustainable forms of consumerism.
Yeah, indeed, a fascinating topic. And Harvey, I believe you've even written a book going a little bit deeper. So maybe you could tell the audience, if they're interested in learning even more, just a quick overview of what you've been up to there.
Well, I'm very grateful to you for asking me about that. This is a great marketing opportunity for me as well. So the book is called Inheritance, The Evolutionary Origins of the Modern World. And it focuses on three major biases in human nature that have to do with conformism, copying on the one hand, religiosity, and tribalism. And all three of those things have a huge impact on why we buy. So if you're interested in that topic, please buy the book.
Fantastic. It's incredibly interesting how I think you guys have used this for such strong social good and to drive detection of some incredibly important topics, but also for us market researchers to apply across the board on some of our more day-to-day challenges of how do we get someone to buy a little bit more cereal or toothpaste. So really interesting to see those worlds fused together. Julia, perhaps I can come back to you. Clearly, this podcast is all about the Market Research Awards. And I want to understand such a prestigious award. What did it mean to the two of you to win this?
It's honestly been a great honor to be winning this prize. And it's also a signal to us that the research that we do and also the societal impact that this can potentially have is taken seriously and is really important. So it's been a great recognition of that. And yeah, we felt very honored to receive the prize. I think it's also great to get the word out there because the private sector in particular can play a huge role in addressing some of these issues, including related issues to radicalization and to preventing or intervening in forms of violent extremism or anti-minority hatred or conspiracy myth. And I believe that it's really great to get our approaches and also some of the innovative methods we apply in our field of research to get that across to the private sector, but of course also to policy audiences. So hopefully this will also translate into a real world impact. And I think this prize is a great step to go in that direction.
Fantastic. And I think impact has been at the heart of everything you guys have done here. I like to finish these podcasts off by really thinking how we inspire the next generation of researchers. And I think what this particular podcast has shown is quite the breadth of the topic of research and data and insights and how it can be used in so many different ways. And I think for potentially young people or people looking to make a career change, the great thing that market research can bring, and research in all shapes and forms, is to impact the world around us. And if the two of you were talking to someone starting off a career in this field, what advice would you give them?
My advice would be to get a research question that really matters to you and not to give up until you've got something like a satisfactory answer. And even when you think you've got a satisfactory answer, persist further because there's always more. I think having a research question is crucial. Sadly, in a lot of academia, I see people, particularly in humanities and social science disciplines, studying topics, but not actually having a question. I think market researchers may actually be in a stronger position in that respect.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Harvey. In the series so far, the point around curiosity has come up, and curiosity makes a great researcher has been a consistent theme. And I think it really aligns there with what you're saying. You need to have that passionate curiosity to go deeper. Julia, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I would say that keeping track of the latest trends, both technological trends, cultural trends, societal trends at large, I think is really highly relevant for coming up with that research question and for finding a niche that will be highly relevant down the line, 10 years down the line or in 20 years. I always felt very strongly about, of course, not predicting trends, but just keeping up with the latest research and the latest surveys on behavioral trends. I think that can really be extremely relevant to also coming up with the questions that will still be relevant in the future.
Fantastic. Guys, it's been a great pleasure having you on the podcast. It's been so good to unpack what's an incredible topic and body of work that the two of you have been working on for such a long time, that's now having such great impact to the wider world. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.